Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 15 of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, and as always, you should buy the original to support the work. Chapter 15. The next morning dawned bright and crisp. The sky was a deep blue, and the sunlight was dazzling on the white mountain tops that rose behind the city. After breakfast, Mr. Wolf announced that he and Aunt Paul would again meet privately that day with Furlak and the other Alorn kings. "Good idea," Beric said. "Gloomy ponderings are good for kings. Unless one has regal obligations, however, it's much too fine a day to be wasted indoors." He grinned mockingly at his cousin. "There's a streak of cruelty in you that I hadn't suspected, Beric," King Enheg said, glancing longingly out a nearby window. "Do the wild boars still come down to the edges of the forest?" Beric asked. "In droves," Enheg replied even more disconsolately. "I thought I might gather a few good men and go out and see if we can thin their numbers a bit," Beric said, his grin even wider now. I was almost sure you had something like that in mind," Enheg said moodily, scratching at his unkempt hair. "I'm doing you a service, Enheg," Beric said. "You don't want your kingdom overrun with the beasts, do you?" Rodar, the fat king of Drasnia, laughed hugely. "I think he's got you, Enheg," he said. "He usually does," Enheg agreed sourly. "I gladly leave such activities to younger and leaner men," Rodar said. He slapped his vast paunch with both hands. "I don't mind a good supper, but I'd rather not have to fight with it first. I make too good a target. The blindest boar in the world wouldn't have much trouble finding me." "Well, Silk," Beric said, "what do you say?" "You're not serious," Silk said. "You must go along, Prince Keldar," Queen Peren insisted. "Someone has to represent the honor of Drasnia in this venture." Silk's face looked pained. "You can be my champion," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Have you been reading Orendish epics again, Your Highness?" Silk asked acidly. "Consider it a royal command," she said. "Some fresh air and exercise won't hurt you. You're starting to look dyspeptic." Silk bowed ironically. "As you wish, Your Highness," he said. "I suppose that if things get out of hand, I can always climb a tree." "How about you, Dernick?" Beric asked. "I don't know much about hunting, friend Beric," Dernick said doubtfully, "but I'll come along if you like." "My lord?" Beric asked the Earl of Selene politely. "Oh no, Lord Beric," Selene laughed. "I outgrew my enthusiasm for such sport years ago. Thanks for the invitation, however." "Hedar!" Beric asked the rangy Algar. Hedar glanced quickly at his father. "Go along, Hedar," Cho'Gath said in his soft voice. "I'm sure King Enheg will lend me a warrior to help me walk." "I'll do it myself, Cho'Hag," Enheg said. "I've carried heavier burdens." "I'll go with you then, Lord Beric," Hedar said. "And thanks for asking me." His voice was deep and resonant, but very soft, much like that of his father. "Well, lad," Beric asked Garion. "Have you lost your wits entirely, Beric?" Aunt Paul snapped. "Didn't you get him into enough trouble yesterday?" That was the last straw. The sudden elation he'd felt at Beric's invitation turned to anger. Garion gritted his teeth and threw away all caution. "If Beric doesn't think I'll just be in the way, I'll be glad to go along," he announced defiantly. Aunt Paul stared at him, her eyes suddenly very hard. "Your cub's growing teeth, Paul," Mr. Wolf chuckled. "Be still, father," Aunt Paul said, still glaring at Garion. "Not this time, miss," the old man said, with a hint of iron in his voice. "He's made his decision, and you're not going to humiliate him by unmaking it for him. Garion isn't a child now. You may not have noticed, but he's almost man-high and filling out now. He'll soon be 15, Paul. You're going to have to relax your grip sometime, and now's as good a time as any to start treating him like a man. She looked at him for a moment. Whatever you say, father, she said at last with deceptive meekness. I'm sure we'll want to discuss this later, though, in private. Mr. Wolf winced. Aunt Paul looked at Gary and then. Try to be careful, dear, she said, and when you come back, we'll have a nice long talk, won't we? Will my lord require my aid in arming himself for the hunt? Lady Merrill asked, in the stilted and insulting manner she always assumed with Beric. That won't be necessary, Merrill, Beric said. I would not neglect any of my duties, she said. Leave it alone, Merrill, Beric said. You've made your point. Have I my lord's permission, then, to withdraw? She asked. You have, he said shortly. Perhaps you ladies would like to join me, Queen Islana said. We'll cast auguries and see if we can predict the outcome of the hunt. Queen Peren, who stood somewhat behind the Queen of Cherrick, rolled her eyes upward in resignation. Queen Sealar smiled at her. Let's go then, Beric said. The boars are waiting. Sharpening their tusks, no doubt, Silk said. Beric led them down to the red door of the armory, where they were joined by a grizzled man with enormously broad shoulders who wore a bull-hide shirt with metal plates sewn on it. This is Torvik, Beric introduced the grizzled man, and Heg's chief huntsman. He knows every boar in the forest by his first name. My lord Beric is overkind, Torvik said, bowing. How does one go about this hunting of boars, friend Torvik? Dernick asked politely. I've never done it before. It's a simple thing, Torvik explained. I take my huntsmen into the forest and we drive the beasts with noise and shouting. You and the other hunters wait for them with these. He gestured at a rack of stout, broad-headed boar spears. When the boar sees you standing in his way, he charges and tries to kill you with his tusks, but instead you kill him with your spear. I see, Dernick said somewhat doubtfully. It doesn't sound very complicated. We wear male shirts, Dernick, Beric said. Our hunters are hardly ever injured seriously. Hardly ever has an uncomfortable ring of frequency to it, Beric, Silk said, fingering a male shirt hanging on a peg by the door. No sport is very entertaining without a certain element of risk, Beric shrugged, hefting a boar spear. Have you ever thought of throwing dice instead? Silk asked. Not with your dice, my friend, Beric laughed. They began pulling on male shirts, while Torvik's huntsmen carried several armloads of boar spears out to the sleighs waiting in the snowy courtyard of the palace. Garion found the male shirt heavy and more than a little uncomfortable. The steel rings dug at his skin, even through his heavy clothes, and every time he tried to shift his posture to relieve the pressure of one of them, a dozen others bit at him. The air was cold as they climbed into the sleighs, and the usual fur robes seemed hardly adequate. They drove through the narrow, twisting streets of Val Alorn, towards the great west gate on the opposite side of the city from the harbor. The breath of the horses steamed in the icy air as they rode. The ragged old blind woman from the temple stepped from a doorway as they passed in the bright morning sun. Hail, Lord Beric, she croaked. Thy doom is at hand. Thou shalt taste it before this day's sun finds its bed. Without a word, Beric rose in his sleigh, took up a boar spear, and cast it with deadly accuracy full at the old woman. With surprising speed, the witchwoman swung her staff and knocked the spear aside in midair. It will avail thee not to try to kill old Margie, she laughed scornfully. Thy spear shall not find her, neither shall thy sword. Go thou, Beric, thy doom awaits thee. And then she turned toward the sleigh in which Garion sat beside the startled Dernick. Hail, Lord of Lords, she intoned. Thy peril this day shall be great, but thou shalt survive it. And it is thy peril which shall reveal the mark of the beast, which is the doom of thy friend Beric. and then she bowed and scampered away before Beric could lay his hands on another spear. What was that about, Garion? Dernick asked, his eyes still surprised. Beric says she's a crazy old blind woman, Garion said. She stopped us when we arrived in Val Alorn after you and the others had already passed. What was all that talk about doom? Dernick asked with a shudder. I don't know, Garion said. Beric wouldn't explain it. It's a bad omen so early in the day, Dernick said. These Cherriks are strange people. Garion nodded in agreement. Beyond the west gate of the city were open fields, sparkling white in the full glare of the morning sun. They crossed the fields toward the dark edge of the forest 2 leagues away, with great plumes of powdery snow flying out behind their racing sleighs. Farmsteads lay muffled in the snow along their track. The buildings were all made of logs and high-peaked wooden roofs. These people seem to be indifferent to danger, Dernick said. I certainly wouldn't want to live in a wooden house, what with the possibility of fire and all. It's a different country, after all, Garion said. We can't expect the whole world to live the way we do in Sandaria. I suppose not, Dernick sighed, but I'll tell you, Garion, I'm not very comfortable here. Some people just aren't meant for travel. Sometimes I wish we never left Falder's farm. I do sometimes, too, Garion admitted. Looking at the towering mountains, they seemed to rise directly out of the forest ahead. Someday it'll be over, though, and we'll be able to go back home again. Dernick nodded and sighed once more. By the time they had entered the woods, Beric had regained his temper and his good regained his temper and his good spirits, and he set about placing the hunters as if nothing had happened. He led Garion through the calf-deep snow to a large tree some distance from the narrow sleigh track. This is a good place, he said. There's a game trail here, and the boars may use it to try to escape the noise of Torvik and his huntsmen. When one comes, brace yourself and hold your spear with its point aimed at his chest. They don't see very well, and he'll run full into your spear before he knows it's there. After that, it's probably best to jump behind a tree. Sometimes the spear makes them very angry. What if I miss? Garion asked. I wouldn't do that, Beric advised. It's not a very good idea. I didn't mean that I was going to do it on purpose, Garion said. Will he try to get away from me, or what? Sometimes he'll try to run, Beric said, but I wouldn't count on it. More likely he'll try to split you up the middle with his tusks. At that point, it's usually a good idea to climb a tree. I'll remember that, Garion said. I won't be far away if you have trouble, Beric promised, handing Garion a pair of heavy spears. Then he trudged back to his sleigh, and they all galloped off, leaving Garion standing alone under the large oak tree. It was shadowy among the dark tree trunks, and bitingly cold. Garion walked around a bit through the snow, looking for the best place to await the boar. The trail Beric had pointed out was a beaten path, winding back through the dark brush, and Garion found the size of the tracks imprinted in the snow on the path alarmingly large. The oak tree with low spreading limbs began to look very inviting, but he dismissed the thought angrily. He was expected to stand on the ground and meet the challenge of the boar, and he decided that he would rather die than hide in a tree like a frightened child. The dry voice in his mind advised him that he spent far too much time worrying about things like that. Until he was grown, no one would consider him a man, so why should he go to all the trouble of trying to seem brave when it wouldn't do any good anyway? The forest was very quiet now, and the snow muffled all sounds. No birds sang, and there was only the occasional paddled thump of snow sliding from overloaded branches to the earth beneath. Garion felt terribly alone. What was he doing here? What business had a good, sensible Sandarian boy here in the endless forests of Cherrick, awaiting the charge of a savage wild pig with only a pair of unfamiliar spears for company? What had the pig ever done to him? He realized that he didn't even particularly like the taste of pork. He was some distance from the beaten forest track, along with which their sleighs had passed, and he set his back to the oak tree, shivered, and waited. He didn't realize how long he had been listening to the sound when he became fully aware of it. It It was not the stamping, squealing rush of a wild boar he had been expecting, but was, rather, the measured pace of several horses moving slowly along the snow-carpeted floor of the forest, and it was coming from behind him. Cautiously, he eased his face around the tree. 3 riders, muffled in furs, emerged from the woods on the far side of the sleigh-churn track. They stopped and sat waiting. 2 of them were bearded warriors, little different from dozens of others Garion had seen in King Enheg's palace. The 3rd man, however, had long flaxen-colored hair and wore no beard. His face had the sullen, pampered look of a spoiled child, although he was a man of middle years, and he sat his horse disdainfully as if the company of the other 2 somehow offended him. After a time, the sound of another horse came from near the edge of the forest. Almost holding his breath, Garion waited. The other rider slowly approached the 3, who sat their horses in the snow at the edge of the trees. It was the sandy-bearded man in the green cloak whom Garion had seen creeping through the passageways of King Enheg's palace 2 nights before. "My lord," the green-haired man said deferentially as he joined the other 3. "Where have you been?" the flaxen-haired man demanded. "Lord Beric took some of his guests on a boar hunt this morning. His route was the same as mine, and I didn't want to follow too closely." The nobleman grunted sourly. "We saw them deeper in the wood," he said. "Well, what have you heard?" "Very little, my lord. The kings are meeting with the old man and the woman in a guarded chamber. I can't get close enough to hear what they're saying." "I'm paying you good gold to get close enough. I have to know what they're saying. Go back to the palace and work out a way to hear what they're talking about." "I'll try, my lord," the green-haired cloaked man said, bowing somewhat stiffly. "You'll do more than try," the flaxen-haired man snapped. "As you wish, my lord," the other said, starting to turn his horse. "Wait," the nobleman commanded. "Were you able to meet with our friend?" "Your friend, my lord," the other corrected with distaste. "I met him, and we went to a tavern and talked a little." "What did he say?" "Nothing very useful. His kind seldom do." "Will he meet us as he said he would?" "He told me that he would. If you want to believe him, that's your affair." The nobleman ignored that. "Who arrived with the king of the Sendars?" "The old man and the woman, another old man, some Sendarian noble, I think, Lord Beric and a weasel-faced Drasnian, and another Sendar, commoner of some sort." "That's all? Wasn't there a boy with them as well?" The spy shrugged. "I didn't think the boy was important," he said. "He's there, then? In the palace?" "He is, my lord. An ordinary Sendar boy of about 14, I'd judge. He seems to be some kind of servant to the woman." "Very well. Go back to the palace and get close enough to that chamber to hear what the kings and the old man are saying." "That may be very dangerous, my lord." "It'll be more dangerous if you don't. Now go, before the ape bear comes back and finds you loitering here." He whirled his horse and, followed by his 2 warriors, plunged back into the forest on the far side of the snowy track that wound among the dark trees. The man in the green cloak sat grimly watching for a moment. Then he, too, turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Garion rose from his crouched position behind the tree. His hands were clenched so tightly around the shaft of his spear that they actually ached. This had gone entirely too far, he decided. The matter must be brought to someone's attention. And then, some way off in the snowy depths of the wood, he heard the sound of hunting horns and the steely clash of swords ringing rhythmically on shields. The huntsmen were coming, driving all the beasts of the forest before them. He heard a crackling in the bushes, and a great stag bounded into view, his eyes wild with fright and his antlers flaring above his head. With 3 huge leaps he was gone. Garion trembled with excitement. Then there was a squealing rush, and a red-eyed sow plunged down the trail, followed by a half-dozen scampering piglets. Garion stepped behind his tree and let them pass. The next squeals were deeper and rang less with fright than with rage. It was the boar. Garion knew that before the beast even broke out of the heavy brush. When the boar appeared, Garion felt his heart quail. This was no fat, sleepy porker, but rather a savage, infuriated beast. The horrid tusks jutted up past the flaring snout were yellow, and bits of twigs and bark clung to them, mute evidence that the boar would slash at anything in his path. Trees, bushes, or a Sandarian boy without sense enough to get out of his way. Then a peculiar thing happened, as in the long-ago fight with Runderig or in the scuffle with Brill's hirelings in the dark streets of Morose. Garion felt his blood begin to surge, and there was a wild ringing in his ears. He seemed to hear a defiant, shouted challenge, and could scarcely accept the fact that it came from his own throat. He suddenly realized that he was stepping into the middle of the trail and crouching with his spear braced and leveled at the massive beast. The boar charged, red-eyed and frothing from the mouth. With a deep-throated squeal of fury, he plunged at the waiting Garion. The powdery snow sprayed up from his churning hooves like foam from the prow of the ship. The snow crystals seemed to hang in the air, sparkling in a single ray of sunlight that chanced just there to reach the forest floor. The shock as the boar hit the spear was frightful, but Garion's aim was good. The broad-bladed spearhead penetrated the coarsely haired chest, and the white froth dripping from the boar's tusk suddenly became bloody foam. Garion felt himself driven back by the impact, his fleet slipping out from under him, and then the shaft of the spear snapped like a dry twig, and the boar was on him. The first slashing, upward, ripping blow of the boar's tusks took Garion full in the stomach, and he felt the wind whoosh out of his lungs. The second slash caught his hip as he tried to roll, gasping out of the way. His chainmail shirt deflected the tusks, saving him from being wounded, but the blows were stunning. The boar's third slash caught him in the back, and he was flung through the air and crashed into a tree. His eyes filled with shimmering light as his head banged against the rough bark. And then Beric was there, roaring and charging through the snow, but somehow it seemed not to be Beric. Garion's eyes, glazed from the shock of the blow to his head, looked uncomprehendingly at something that could not be true. It was Beric. There could be no doubt of that, but it was also something else. Oddly, as if somehow occupying the same space as Beric, there was also a huge, hideous bear. The images of the two figures clashing through the snow were superimposed, their movements identical, as if in sharing the same space they also shared the same thoughts. Huge arms grasped up the wriggling, mortally wounded boar and crushed in upon it. Bright red blood fountained from the boar's mouth, and the shaggy half-man thing that seemed to be Beric and something else at the same time raised the dying pig and smashed it brutally to the ground. The man-thing lifted its awful face and roared in earth-shaking triumph as the light slid away from Garion's eyes, and he felt himself drifting down into the gray well of unconsciousness. There was no way of knowing how much time had passed. He came to in the sleigh. Silk was applying a cloth filled with snow to the back of his neck as they flew across the glaring white fields toward Val Alorn. "I see that you've decided to live," Silk grinned at him. "Where's Beric?" Garion mumbled groggily. "In the sleigh behind us," Silk said, glancing back. "Is he all right?" "What could hurt Beric?" Silk asked. "I mean, does he seem like himself?" "He seems like Beric to me," Silk shrugged. "No, boy, lie still. That wild pig may have cracked your ribs." He placed his hand on Garion's chest and gently held him down. "My boar?" Garion demanded weakly. "Where is it?" "The huntsmen are bringing it," Silk said. "You'll get your triumphal entry. If I might suggest it, however, you should give some thought to the virtue of constructive cowardice. These instincts of yours could shorten your life." But Garion had already slipped back into unconsciousness. And then they were in the palace, and Beric was carrying him, and Aunt Paul was there, white-faced at the sight of all the blood. "It's not his," Beric assured her quickly. "He speared a boar, and it bled on him while they were tussling. I think the boy's all right. A little rap on the head is all." "Bring him," Aunt Paul said curtly, and led the way up the stairs toward Garion's room. Later, with his head and chest wrapped and a foul-tasting cup of Aunt Paul's brewing making him lightheaded and sleepy, Garion lay in his bed listening as Aunt Paul finally turned on Beric. "You great overgrown dolt!" she raged. "Do you see what all your foolishness has done?" "The lad's very brave," Beric said, his voice low and sunk in a kind of bleak melancholy. "Brave doesn't interest me," Aunt Paul snapped. Then she stopped. "What's the matter with you?" she demanded. She reached out suddenly and put her hands on the sides of the huge man's head. She looked for a moment into his eyes and then slowly released him. "Oh," she said softly. "It finally happened, I see." "I couldn't control it, Polgara," Beric said in misery. "It'll be all right, Beric," she said, gently touching his bowed head. It'll never be all right again," Beric said. "Get some sleep," she told him. "It won't seem so bad in the morning." The huge man turned and quietly left the room. Garion knew they were talking about the strange thing he had seen when Beric had rescued him from the boar, and he wanted to ask Aunt Paul about it, but the bitter drink she had given him pulled him down into a deep and dreamless sleep before he could put the word together to ask the question.